Hello everyone, Mr. Thinker 225 here. Today I'll be discussing the morality of atheism. But before I can do that, I must share an introduction with you all. Alright, so today I'll be reviewing an atheist who thinks morality is compatible with atheism. Let's see how this goes.
Hello everyone. I am James the Atheist, and I'm going to explain why atheism is 100% compatible with morality without the need for a god.
Atheism is compatible with morality because ethical behavior can be rooted in reason, empathy, and social cooperation rather than divine command. From an evolutionary perspective, humans developed moral traits such as altruism and fairness because they helped our ancestors survive in groups.
Okay. So, it sounds like you are exploring the philosophical intersection of ethics and belief. Here is a breakdown of the primary argument regarding whether or not morality can exist independently of a divine being. The counter-argument suggests that without a god, morality lacks an objective foundation or ultimate authority. If there is no higher power to establish universal laws, then morality arguably becomes a matter of personal opinion, cultural fashion, or biological instinct. Without a transcendent lawgiver, critics argue there is no way to say that one action is truly, objectively evil. It is merely a preference or a social convention. From this perspective, if the universe is purely material and accidental, there is no ultimate grounding for why we ought to behave one way instead of another.
From an atheist perspective, Christians often confuse the source of morality with the practice of it. While Christians argue that morality needs a transcendent lawgiver to be objective, atheists contend that if God is the only reason to be good, then morality is merely a form of divine obedience rather than true ethical character. Let's use the Euthyphro dilemma for an example. If an action is good because God commands it, morality is arbitrary. But if God commands it because it is already good, then goodness exists independently of him. Atheists argue that objective moral facts can be grounded in the tangible reality of sentient suffering and well-being. In this view, harming others is objectively wrong, because it causes real, measurable damage to a conscious being.
The Euthyphro dilemma is frequently criticized as being built upon several logical fallacies, primarily the false dilemma, or false dichotomy. Critics argue it presents two extreme options while ignoring a middle ground that aligns with many theological and philosophical frameworks. This is the most common critique. The dilemma claims that morality must either be independent of God or a result of God's arbitrary whim. Many theists argue the standard of good is neither external to God nor an arbitrary command, but is God's own immutable nature. In this view, God commands what is good because he is good by nature. He cannot command evil because it would contradict his character. Next, the argument presents a category error. Some philosophers argue the dilemma commits a category error by treating God as a creature or human-like subject whose opinions are separate from truth. It assumes that God's will and objective truth are two separate categories that must be reconciled. If God is the standard of truth and goodness himself, asking which one is subject to the other is a logical error, like asking if a triangle is subject to its three sides. Alright, next, this argument is said to rely on equivocating, using a word in two different senses. The term subject. First, in human terms, being subject to a law implies a limit on power or a bias. And second, in a theological context, saying God is subject to goodness is misapplied because it suggests God's will is a mere opinion rather than an expression of essential reality. The next logical fallacy is Petitio Principii. Critics argue the dilemma begs the question by assuming from the start that God is not essentially good. The dilemma forces a choice that assumes a gap between God and morality. If one defines God as a perfectly good being, the dilemma's arbitrary command horn becomes impossible by definition, effectively dismantling the trap. And lastly, we have tautology, or circular reasoning. While not a fallacy in the dilemma itself, the third option response is sometimes accused of creating a tautology. If good is defined as God's nature, then the statement God is good becomes God is God, which some argue is a meaningless circular statement. Apologists counter this by stating that identifying God's essence with goodness provides substantive information about his character rather than just a repetitive definition.
I hear this all the time from religious folks. They consistently say that it's impossible for an atheist to be moral. But the reality is that this is absolutely stupid. To try and make that claim.
Well, is it bad for me to make that claim? If you deny the existence of God, then you also deny the existence of morality. It's very simple, actually.
I only say this because I personally believe that the whole Christian morality argument just isn't true. As an atheist, I can still be a morally good person.
Okay, so truth matters then. So question, what exactly is truth? And how can you determine whether or not something is good or bad using only truth?
Let's try another example of atheistic morality. Our definition of morality is primarily based on whatever society determines and agrees commonly upon, and is then perceived as negative, and therefore is bad. Truth would be what is real, and something bad would be something that's not good. It's pretty simple. I don't know how much simpler I explain this to you religious folks. Something bad is just something that is intrinsically negative and not good.
Say you're pretty deep with those definitions today. So question, so society agreeing on something determines whether or not something is good or bad? Again, based on what exactly?
So in other words, all of society has to agree on it.
Okay. So what you're saying is that people are deciding what is good and bad, and that all of society that has to agree on it? Again, based on what exactly? And has all of society ever agreed on anything? Question, so how strict of a majority is needed? 90%? 75%? Maybe 51%? And looking past this, then would it just be the majority of society that get to determine what is good and bad?
You see, without an objective moral lawgiver, such as the Christian God, then the concept of good simply collapses into what I would describe as being economically convenient. This would then suggest that something such as slavery, for example, was good. This is only because it freed ancient elites from manual labor to pursue philosophy.
By claiming that this intellectual output justified systemic oppression, his explanation serves as a prime example of a poor argument. It reduces human beings to mere tools for the comfort of others, while ignoring that any coherent secular morality must be built on empathy, consent, and the non-negotiable preservation of human rights, rather than raw utility or profit. Also, you think slavery is supposed to be a good thing? I think you should re-evaluate things more carefully before you speak.
No, just to clarify. Now, obviously slavery is a bad thing, and basically everyone alive will agree with this. This was just a type of analogy to get you folks thinking logically.
Okay, phew. You had me going for a second there. But in all seriousness, though, what about the other countries that actively still have slavery around? Because they would disagree with your stance on morality. So question, do you think that morality is not wrong for them, but it's wrong for us? I'm a little confused. Let's see if I understand. So, depending on what country you're in, that's what's going to determine what's right and wrong? So that's it? Your geographical location?
That's pretty much as good as I can put it. It's essentially just the culture of the society.
Okay. Well, let's bring this back around. You said slavery was wrong 200 years ago in the United States. And yet back then, we said that it was good. So either you're wrong, or were they wrong? Which is it? And if morality is just an agreed upon, subjective construct of society, then who's to say whether or not we're right, or whether or not they were right? Again, based on what standards are you concluding this from? The society back then all mutually agreed that slavery was good. Now society, for the most part, agrees that slavery is wrong. So how can you possibly determine what is actually right or wrong? Whenever you're claiming that morality is subjective, it is then an arbitrary construct that is something that is just based on whatever the people at the time are agreeing upon.
Like, come on, folks. Think, McFly. Think. It's just kind of obvious. Everyone just has a conscience. And for the fellow religious folks watching, please, your head, the same head your God gave you to think logically and rationally about simple matters such as the nature of morality.
Yes, we do all have a conscience. That is correct. We try to hide that down. We call that suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. It's where we try to actually distort reality in our minds to know what's right, but yet we try to pretend that is okay to do the opposite. And then the majority is just currently suppressing, and that will be the new thing we would all agree upon, for which is good or bad, even if it's not actually a bad thing. I hear from non-believers all the time where I think morality comes from, and I always respond with this. Going back to our slavery example, if there is a moral law, then there has to be a moral lawgiver. And so with something like the Bible, with the revealed words of God, we can actually see that something such as slavery is objectivity bad. And also speaking on the kind of slavery that the United States had, we were kidnapping and enslaving people. That's a very bad thing that the Bible actually condemns and says is worthy of the death penalty.
Let me go back to my example on slavery, and pay attention, religious folks. How can you trust anything your God says when he directly says in your own book that slavery is okay?
No, that would be indentured servitude. That's a very different classification of slavery that really doesn't exist in the world anymore. What we had in the United States, and what the Bible very plainly condemns, is like what happened where Africa was kidnapping other Africans and then selling them to colonialists, and then they would bring them back on boats and enslave them here. That is a horrible thing because it was kidnapping and selling human beings. This is the very thing that the Bible literally says is evil, and anyone who does it should be put to death.
And Christians, remember, that's just your interpretation. Opinions aren't facts.
No, that's just called contextual comprehension. That's where you read the full context, and then based on that context, you can actually understand what it's saying. Interpreting something is usually required when you pull something out of its context, and then you're trying to understand what it means without having all of the other references. But regardless of all that, whenever you're making the claim that something is good or bad, you actually have to borrow from the Christian worldview. You have to pretend that God exists, just so you can claim that something is morally right or wrong.
Now, just like Richard Dawkins argued, one of my favorites, by the way, very smart. Anyways, he argued that there is no such thing as good or bad, that there was just blind and pitiless indifferences.
That's exactly my point. That literally means that there's no such thing as morality according to the atheistic worldview, and therefore, according to Richard Dawkins, a leading member of global atheism, you cannot be a moral person. I rest my case. All right. I believe that I have thoroughly demonstrated that the atheistic worldview cannot have morality, and that the Christian worldview can have morality. If any further questions about this, then feel free to let me know.